Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 45 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most extraordinary journeys of the past, expeditions that still shape how we see the world today. In this story, we are following 17-year-old Georg Forster, a German traveler who set sail in the 18th century with his father, a naturalist, aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. This episode begins on the island of Tahiti, deep in the South Pacific, as the crew prepares to depart for the next leg of their voyage. Georg's account was originally written in the language of the 18th century, but I've translated it into modern English for better understanding. Georg's knowledge reflects the worldview of the late Enlightenment, so I'll occasionally step in to provide historical context and background, so you can fully appreciate the ideas, observations, and contrasts that made his travel writing so exceptional. Let's continue our voyage. What happened in the last episode? In the previous episode, the HMS Resolution remained anchored off Tahiti, where the crew continued their botanical work in the lush plains of Matawai and the fertile valley of Ahonu. Georg Forster and his companions revisited Tahiti, a spirited local who welcomed them like family. Their mountaintop excursion yielded both rare plants and a glimpse into Tahitian bird life. Back on board, they hosted members of the royal family, including Teeri Watau, the king's younger brother, who shared valuable accounts of Tahiti's recent political history. These tales introduced Otu, the current king of Tahiti, who had assumed power following a series of familial conflicts and warfare with the ruler of the neighboring peninsula, Tearabu. Otu, though young, had proven himself to be a thoughtful and effective leader. Tensions rose again when a stolen musket led to reprisals from Captain Cook and temporarily straining relations. However, the situation was diffused and contact resumed with local key figures, including the formerly powerful Oporea and Amo, now living in diminished circumstances. As the HMS Resolution prepared to continue its voyage, Otu staged an impressive naval display, revealing the martial discipline and grandeur of Tahiti's war canoes, drawing unexpected parallels to ancient Greece. Saturday, May 14, 1774, Tahiti.
Otu came aboard to dine with them one last time. He suggested that Georg's father and Mr. Hodges remain in Tahiti. He promised to make them heirs in the wealthy districts of Opara and Matavai. Whether he acted out of self-interest or generosity remained unclear. It was, however, obvious that they declined the offer, no matter how well-intentioned it was. After lunch, they weighed anchor and set sail. Otu asked Captain Cook to fire a few cannons and stayed on board until the very last moment. Once all the other Tahitians had left the ship, he too said farewell. He embraced each of them warmly, one by one. The thunder of the cannons prevented the sadness or melancholy, which often comes with such partings, from taking over. One sailor took advantage of the commotion to swim unnoticed to the island. However, they spotted him once he was already in the water. Some canoes rowed toward him, presumably to pick him up. The captain launched a boat, which brought the sailor back. As punishment, he was put in chains for 14 days. It seemed obvious that the plan had been arranged between the sailor and the islanders. The Tahitians would likely have benefited from his presence just as much as he would have from a life among them. The difference between the life of a common sailor on a ship and that of an islander was enormous. It was understandable that he tried to escape the hardships of a voyage around the world. He hoped for a peaceful, carefree life in this paradisiacal climate. Even the highest happiness he could have attained in England would not have offered the comforts he dreamed of as a simple Tahitian. Upon returning to England, he would have faced the same hard labor again. Poor rations, endless night watches, and more dangers at sea. The desire to flee such a fate was therefore easy to grasp. Had the sailor truly succeeded in finding a quiet life, he would still have had to fear being forced into military service. In the midst of his joys, the danger would have remained: to die in battle or return crippled. Even if he escaped that, the harsh life of a laborer in England awaited him. There, he would have had to work hard every day just to earn his bread, burdened by a toil that was hardly felt in Tahiti. While in Europe, grain had to be sown, harvested, threshed, and processed with great effort. The Tahitians relied on the breadfruit tree. 3 such trees were enough to feed a person for nearly an entire year. Excess fruit was fermented and preserved for the remaining part of the year. Even the more demanding plants, like the mulberry tree or arum root, required no more work than a vegetable patch in Europe. A breadfruit tree grew from a simple branch stuck into the ground. Banana plants sprouted on their own, and the palm trees bore abundant fruit naturally. The few tasks that were necessary, like building homes or making tools, were done willingly and for one's own benefit. The life of the Tahitians followed a pleasant rhythm of rest and enjoyment. Their land was blessed with fertile soil and a mild climate. The sea breezes cooled the air, and the sky was almost always clear. These conditions ensured the health and beauty of the people. The men were well-proportioned and of strong build. Their faces radiated a natural calmness. Large eyes, pronounced eyebrows, and broad foreheads gave them a noble appearance, further accentuated by their thick facial hair. The women, too, were graceful. They won the hearts of the men through their natural kindness and their eagerness to please. In the way of life of the Tahitians, there was a consistent simplicity and uniformity. At sunrise, they rose and hurried to brooks and springs to wash and refresh themselves. After that, they worked or wandered about until the heat of the day forced them to rest in their huts or in the shade of the trees. During these pauses, they took care of their hair. They smoothed it down and anointed it with fragrant oils. Sometimes they played the flute, sang songs, or lay in the grass listening to the birds. Around midday or later came their mealtime. After eating, they returned to household tasks or simple pastimes. In all they did, they showed mutual goodwill. Even the youth were raised with love and tenderness for their family. Cheerful banter, free of malice, simple stories, joyful dancing, and a modest evening meal led into the night. At the end of the day, they bathed again in the river. Content with this simple way of life, the inhabitants of this fortunate climate knew neither sorrow nor worry, and despite their ignorance, could rightly be called happy. In the eyes of those who valued only sensual pleasures, this appeared to be a great advantage. It was therefore hardly surprising that a sailor, perhaps even less reflective than his comrades, sought only the joys of the moment. With greater judgment, however, he might have realized that a man of his kind, made for an active life, familiar with 1,000 things unknown to the Tahitians, and accustomed to thinking about past and future, would soon have grown weary of such constant stillness and monotony. Such a condition could only be bearable for a people whose ideas were as simple and limited as those found among the Tahitians. As they left Tahiti, an unexpected sight on board drew everyone's attention. A young girl who had decided to return with them to the island of Raiatea was on board. She had been taken to Tahiti several years earlier by a lover, and now longed to see her parents again. They were still alive, and she hoped to be received with love. In a society where selfishness and ambition played little role, a youthful mistake could easily be forgiven. The girl had remained hidden while O2 was still on the ship, since he had strictly forbidden any women from leaving the island. She only revealed herself once they were in open sea. Alongside her, Huaheine, his servant, and 2 other men from Bora Bora also joined the voyage. They trusted they would be received by the crew as kindly as Huaheine had been during the previous journey. The company of these passengers helped shorten the crossing from Tahiti to Huaheine. The girl wore the uniform of an officer and felt so comfortable in it that she refused to take it off. She was unashamed to eat with the officers and laughed at the prejudice of her countrywomen who would have avoided such behavior. The girl displayed a remarkable natural intelligence. With a proper education, she would have made a fine impression even among European ladies. Her lively and friendly manner endeared her to everyone on board, and made her an exceptional figure, even without formal learning.
Sunday, May 15, 1774, Huaheine.
After sailing through the night, the island of Huaheine lay before them the next morning. In the afternoon, they anchored in the northern arm of the harbor of War, about 50 meters from the shore. This closeness to land brought many visitors aboard. The locals offered pigs for sale but asked for hatchets in exchange, an item that had grown scarce on the ship and was now reserved for more important purposes. Ori, the chief of the island, came aboard shortly before sunset in a small canoe. He brought the captain a pig and a war breastplate as gifts, for which he received suitable return presents. He also handed over some pepper roots, though without the ceremonies that had accompanied such exchanges during their earlier visit. In the evening, the air was perfectly still. Because the ship lay so close to shore, they could observe the evening routines in the huts of the islanders from on board. With delight, they watched how people sat around their lamps made from oily nuts, chatting and spending the evening together.
Monday, May 16th, 1774, Huaheine.
The next morning, one of the first visitors aboard was Porea, the young man from Tahiti, who had traveled with them some months earlier and had unexpectedly remained behind on Raiatea. He confessed that this had happened by accident and against his intentions. A pretty girl, with whom he had started a romance, had arranged to meet him at a certain place. But instead of his lover, he found her father and several strong men waiting. They beat him, stripped him of his European clothes, and kept him captive until the ship had departed. After his release, he had taken the first opportunity to travel to Huaheine. The hospitality of his friends there seemed to have pleased him greatly, as he now appeared visibly well-nourished. From Porea's unfortunate tale, it could be inferred that the daughters of the island were not always free to act as they wished in matters of love. Still, it was questionable whether the girl's father had any right to not only beat Porea, but also rob him of his clothing. That morning, they went ashore early to explore the saltwater lakes to the north, not far from the harbor. These lakes were separated from the sea only by a narrow stone ridge. The ridge was lined with coconut palms, though it barely rose above the water, and was covered by only a thin layer of sand. Just beyond the ridge, the ground turned marshy and sloped gently down to the shoreline. The shore itself consisted of pure mud, which both in appearance and in its unpleasant smell seemed to contain some kind of sulfur compound. In the outer swamps, various Indian plant species grew, and the lake was home to many wild ducks. However, reaching them was difficult, as there was a real risk of sinking into the mire. Aside from this inconvenience, the area was quite picturesque, though only sparsely inhabited. The locals likely considered the vapors rising from the muddy shore to be unhealthy. During their walk, one of the islanders treated them to coconuts, a rarity at that time of year. On the way back, their servant, who was carrying a sack of plants and another of small iron tools, was attacked just a few steps behind them by several islanders and thrown to the ground. Presumably, the attackers intended to rob him. But when the group noticed what was happening in time, the would-be thieves quickly fled. It was already the second time their people had been assaulted so boldly on this island. Overall, the inhabitants here, under the weak rule of the old Ori, seemed to live more wildly than the Tahitians and other peoples of the Society Islands. The chief in question appeared even more frail and inactive during this visit than he had at their first encounter. Both his mental and physical strength had clearly declined. His eyes were red and inflamed, his body thin and weakened. The cause was soon identified. He had fallen into drinking and consumed large quantities of the strongest intoxicating pepper drink. Huaheine had spent several nights drinking with him and woke each time with a severe headache.
The intoxicating drink mentioned by Georg Forster is kawa, which has a long tradition throughout the South Pacific. Made from the roots of the plant Piper methysticum, kawa is washed out in water and consumed as a ritual or social beverage. Especially in Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, kawa plays a central role in both ceremonial and everyday gatherings. In traditional South Pacific societies, kawa is often consumed on important occasions, at political meetings, or during spiritual ceremonies. It serves to ease tensions, strengthen social bonds, and, in some cultures, act as an offering to gods or ancestors. Kawa has relaxing, anxiety-reducing, and mildly intoxicating effects, but rarely impairs mental clarity. In modern times, it remains an integral part of many communities, serving not only ritual but increasingly recreational purposes. However, long-term or excessive consumption of kawa can have health consequences. A common side effect is so-called kawa dermopathy, a dry, scaly skin condition caused by the influence of kavalactones on metabolism. Regular use can also put strain on the liver, especially in non-traditional preparations that include not only the roots but other parts of the plant as well, Some studies suggest that excessive kawa use may lead to malnutrition, muscle wasting, and, in rare cases, liver damage. Tuesday, May 17, 1774, Huaheine.
In the morning, they once again walked to the inland lakes. They brought back many glass beads, shells, and sea urchins that the locals had gathered for them along the coast. Various chiefs presented them with pigs and breastplates. These men came solely to visit old acquaintances and insisted on handing over their gifts only after being personally received and having greeted their friends. The following day, they climbed a mountain entirely planted with breadfruit, pepper, and mulberry trees, along with yam roots and arum plants. The mulberry trees were especially well tended. The ground between them had been carefully weeded and was fertilized with crushed shells and, in places, with glass beads. The entire plantation was surrounded by a deep ditch to allow water to drain. In some areas, ferns and other brush had been burned down to prepare the soil for planting anew. Higher up the mountain, they found a house. The residents, an old woman and her daughter, welcomed them with great hospitality. They gave the women glass beads, nails, and red feathers, though the feathers were seen more as curiosities than as useful items. Overall, the people of Huaheine valued these goods far more soberly than the Tahitians. They regarded them as mere decoration, lacking real worth, and were unwilling to trade them for anything truly useful. For pigs and other food, they demanded hatchets or smaller iron goods. This demand was by no means unreasonable. In the past, they had agreed to such terms. But on this journey, the crew declined, as there was no shortage of fresh meat, and their stock of iron tools had already diminished noticeably. That the inhabitants of Huaheine and Tahiti placed such different value on the red feathers was clearly due to natural differences between the islands. It showed that the people of Tahiti must have been wealthier than those of Huaheine. The reason was easy to see. Huahine had little flat land. The people had to cultivate the hillsides as well, just to meet their basic needs. Since securing food required more effort, they placed greater value on it and were less able to indulge in luxuries than the Tahitians. In the days that followed, they were repeatedly, and sometimes quite brazenly, robbed, without being able to recover what was taken. However, anyone caught in the act was punished severely. A group of petty officers had gone up a mountain with a Marine to shoot birds. The Marine carried a few hatchets and other small iron items. Their muskets misfired several times along the way, which apparently encouraged a local man who had been following them to attempt a theft. When the Marine set the bag down for a moment, the islander snatched it and ran off. The next day, the same officers attended a public dance, a Hiwa. Luckily, they recognized the thief among the spectators. He admitted the theft and offered to bring breastplates of equal value to the stolen hatchets if they would forgive him. They accepted the offer, and the man kept his word the following day. He did not yet seem to belong to those hardened wrongdoers who had lost all sense of decency, but rather showed genuine gratitude for the leniency shown to him. Another man, who attempted to steal a powder horn, was caught and punished with a beating. Even the Tahitian woman who had come with them to Huaheine was not spared. When she believed herself unobserved in a house, she was attacked. Her assailants tried to forcibly strip her of the European clothing she had worn since her arrival. Fortunately, some of the men arrived in time and drove the attackers off. The incident frightened the girl so deeply that from then on, she never ventured ashore without an escort. But the hardships the girl endured here were not yet over. That very evening, she suffered a particularly humiliating experience. Accompanied by a few officers, she attended a Hiwa, a dramatic dance. Unfortunately, the subject of the performance was her own story, and her earlier romantic escape from the island was made into a mockery. The girl was overcome with shame and on the verge of leaving the place in tears. Her companions, the officers, had to encourage her with much persuasion to remain until the end of the performance. The final scene, which portrayed the reception she might expect from her parents, was rendered in a way that was anything but flattering. It appeared that the play was a satire intended to ridicule the girl and serve as a warning to others not to follow her example. This nation seemed to have a natural talent for improvising such short performances, and it was highly likely that this was indeed their purpose.
Thursday, May 19th, 1774, Huaheine.
Today, they took a walk to the long sea inlet, where Dr. Sparman had been attacked and robbed during their previous stay, about 8 months earlier. Rain clouds began to gather, and the first showers became so heavy that they sought shelter in a small hut to avoid being drenched to the skin. A family lived in the hut and received them kindly, immediately offering fish and fresh breadfruit. Among the peoples of the South Seas, food and drink were always the first gesture of hospitality. An elderly woman of status and distinction had also taken refuge in the hut. She was accompanied by a servant who was bringing a pig to her house. Once the rain had passed, they continued their way together. The woman not only offered them the pig as a gift, but also invited them to visit her home, which was some distance away. As they had made no fixed plans for the walk, they agreed. The rain had made the path slippery, so they had to proceed with care. Yet the many new plants they discovered along the way made up for the inconvenience. Their guide led them over a mountain ridge to the far side of the island, where the sea came into view. By the time they reached the plain, the weather had completely cleared. The shoreline formed a pleasant bay, protected by a coral reef that extended far out into the ocean. Within the reef lay a small island inhabited by many wild ducks, jungle fowl, and snipes. While they hunted there for some time, the kind-hearted woman made sure that the nearby islanders brought refreshments. After they had shot enough game, she guided them back over a side ridge and through a lovely cultivated valley to her home on the seashore. There they met an older man, her husband, and a large family, some of whom were already grown. Their hosts served them a generous meal of stewed chicken, breadfruit, and coconuts. After the meal, they were taken back to the ship in the family's canoe, a distance of about 9 kilometers by sea, though the overland route would have been at least twice as long. There was a tenderness in this woman's behavior that was rarely found, even among the most hospitable people of these islands. Georg was deeply moved by this renewed confirmation of the original goodness of the human heart, a heart which, in a state of simplicity, untouched by ambition, lust, or other passions, is surely not inclined toward evil.
Friday, May 20, 1774, Huaheine.
Today, they remained on board throughout the morning. After lunch, they went ashore with Captain Cook to visit a large house that resembled a caravanserai and was inhabited by several families. These people had gathered there in order to be close to the Europeans. Among them were some low-ranking chiefs, though the island's ruler, Ori, had gone to another part of the island. While they were still speaking with those present, a few islanders brought troubling news. The first and second lieutenants, along with a pilot, had been completely robbed by a band of thieves. This news caused great agitation among those in the house. Many of the locals fled immediately, fearing punishment from the Europeans. The Europeans themselves were concerned, especially since the Tahitian word mate could mean either to beat or to kill. Despite repeated questioning, they couldn't determine which meaning applied in this case. Their fears, however, were soon relieved when the supposedly lost men returned unharmed, still dressed and carrying all their hunting gear. They reported that during the hunt at the lakes they had been set upon. The attackers had tried to wrest their fowling pieces from them. When they refused to give them up, they were robbed by force and severely beaten. At last, a commander arrived, and through his mediation, the thieves returned the guns and other stolen articles. Relieved by the fortunate outcome, everyone returned on board. They noticed, however, that many of the people from the neighborhood had withdrawn.
Saturday, May 21st, 1774, Huaheine.
The next morning, Ori sent word to Captain Cook through Huaheine, who had slept ashore, that the deed of the previous day had been committed by 13 men. He declared that he alone was not able to punish the offenders and asked Cook to send him 22 armed men. Ori had indicated this number by as many sticks. He intended then to add some of his own warriors and together proceed against the rebels. Captain Cook was unsure whether he had correctly understood Ori's message. Therefore, he returned ashore with Huaheine to question Ori in person. But because their knowledge of the language was insufficient, they could not obtain any more precise information. In this uncertainty, Captain Cook called a meeting with the officers after his return to clarify the matter. The second lieutenant openly confessed that the first aggression had begun on their side, and that they had brought the trouble upon themselves. He explained that one of them had shot a few wild ducks on the lake and asked a native to fetch them from the water. The native, who had done this several times before, had this time refused to continue behaving like a dog. The officer had taken offense at this and, incomprehensibly, had beaten the man until he consented. The native then skillfully pushed through the mud to the water, but instead of bringing the ducks back, he carried them to the opposite shore. He probably intended to keep the ducks as compensation for the mistreatment. A sailor in the party who disagreed with this conduct had loaded his musket and fired at the native, fortunately missing. As the seaman prepared to load a second time, the natives present had taken the musket from him. One of the officers had nevertheless found an opportunity to fire his musket and had shot a native in the leg with shot. This only further incensed the others, and they avenged the act with violent blows. Huaheine's servant, a strong young man who had sided with the officers, fought desperately, but was finally overpowered by numbers. After this confession, the incident took on a new perspective. Nevertheless, Captain Cook wished to ask Commander Ori for his opinion once more. He asked Georg's father to accompany him because he understood the language better than anyone else on board. Ori explained that he proposed to attack the houses of the perpetrators, who had probably rebelled against him as well. He planned to confiscate their pigs and other property to provide compensation to the Europeans. Captain Cook returned with this explanation and assembled a party of 47 men, including officers, Dr. Sparman, Georg's father, and Georg himself. It was probably not Cook's intention to help Ori punish his rebellious subjects so much as to show the natives that he disapproved of their arbitrary actions. The party landed and marched with Ori and some natives to the district of the incident. As they advanced, an ever larger number of islanders joined them, some fetching weapons from the surrounding houses. Ori himself carried a spear over 3 meters long, tipped with a stingray spine. After about 2 miles, they halted. Huaheine reported that the natives planned to surround the party and cut them off from the ship. Captain Cook was not deterred by this and merely ordered that the followers be kept at a distance so that friend and foe could better be distinguished in the event of an attack. Ori and the other commanders had to continue to march with the party. After another march of about 3 miles, they reached a fork in the path. One trail led over a steep rock, the other wound along the foot of the mountain. Captain Cook chose the steeper route. The climb was arduous, but on the other side they found steps cut into the rock, which made the descent into the plain considerably easier. This pass was so critical to the safety of their return that Captain Cook planned to have part of his crew hold it. But when he noticed that the large group of islanders who were supposed to stay behind on Ori's order were still slowly following, he decided to abandon the entire plan. He gave the order to turn back directly. The islanders were easily convinced that this was simply because the enemy was too far off and no longer worth pursuing. On the way back, they passed a spacious house where Ori had coconuts served. As they were enjoying the refreshments, some islanders arrived carrying young banana shoots, 2 dogs, and a piglet. These they presented to Captain Cook after a long speech, which, judging by the context, must have referred to the purpose of their expedition. A large pig was also shown, but then driven away again. After the ceremony, they hurried to the shore and arrived around noon. Captain Cook ordered the men to fire volleys over the sea in the direction of the ship. They took great pleasure in the astonishment of the islanders, who had not expected the bullets to fly so far, nor imagined that the Europeans could maintain such a steady rate of fire. The planned military expedition thus ended without bloodshed, which was welcomed by all those who did not regard human life with indifference. Others, however, were disappointed that there had been no fighting. Accustomed to scenes of war and violence, they seemed to see no difference between shooting at people or at a target. Their march through the island likely deterred the locals from coming aboard. That afternoon, only a few fruits were brought for trade. But the next morning, they received various gifts from their acquaintances, a sign that all had been forgiven. Among the visitors was a chief named Morurua, who had developed a special fondness for Georg's father. He came with his wife and relatives. None of them arrived empty-handed, and they too were generously gifted in return. Morurua felt that he had been rewarded far beyond what he deserved. His expressive glances conveyed his joy and gratitude.
Monday, May 23rd, 1774, Huaheine.
The next morning, just as they were about to set sail from the island, Morurua came on board once again. He brought more gifts, and finally took his leave with tears in his eyes. Huaheine's 3 friends remained behind on the island, but they took another islander on board. Ori had entrusted him with a message for Opuni, the king of Bora Bora. The envoy appeared to be a rather simple-minded person, but no one could coax the secret of his mission from him. His name suited his task remarkably well. He was called Hurry Hurry. By the next midday, May 24th, they anchored off the island of Raiatea, more precisely in the harbor of Huaheine. It took until evening to maneuver the ship into the middle of the harbor. The chief, Orea, came on board and expressed great joy at their return. It no doubt elevated their standing that both Huaheine and Hurry Hurry had entrusted themselves to the crew. The following morning they accompanied the captain to Orea's house. There they met his wife and daughter, Poyadua. As they entered the hut, both women wept loudly. The mother wounded her head with a shark tooth and caught the drops of blood in a piece of cloth. But it did not take long for them both to be cheerful again, as if nothing had happened. Due to heavy rain, they were unable to return to the ship until midday. In the meantime, the ship had been brought into a narrow cove near the shore to make it easier to collect fresh water. In the afternoon, as much as the rainy weather allowed, they took a walk along the bay. On the beach lay a countless number of canoes pulled up onto land, and every house and hut was full of people. Many were preparing for communal meals, and it was clear that nothing would be lacking. Everywhere lay large supplies of the finest foods. It was known that these islands had a special group or class of men and women called Ariois. This group gathered from time to time, traveled from island to island, and celebrated extravagantly wherever they went. While the ship had been anchored at Huaheine, such a caravan of over 700 Ariois had been present, and it was this same group they now encountered again. One morning, they had crossed over from Huaheine to Raiatea in about 70 canoes. After spending a few days on the eastern coast of the island, they had now settled on the western side. These Ariois were exclusively persons of high status and appeared to belong to the class of chiefs. Some of them had large tattooed areas on their skin. According to Huaheine, these members were regarded as the most respected in the community, with the size and number of tattoos indicating their rank. Nearly all of them were strong, well-built, and referred to themselves as warriors. Huaheine showed great respect for this community and assured them that he himself had been admitted to it. The members were bound together by close ties of friendship and fully observed the laws of hospitality among themselves. When one Arioi visited another, he could be certain of being generously supplied with everything necessary, not just for basic needs, but also for comfort. Personal acquaintance played no role. The guest was introduced immediately to the others, and all strove to outdo one another in kindness, hospitality, and gift-giving. Huaheine emphasized that all the privileges he had enjoyed in Tahiti had come to him solely through his membership in this community. The 2 young men who had first seen him aboard their ship in Tahiti were also Ariois. In that capacity, they had given him their clothing, as he then possessed only European garments. It appeared that nearly every respected family had at least one or more members who joined this group. The unchanging fundamental law of the Ariois stated that none of their members could have children. As far as they could gather from the accounts of the most reasonable islanders, the Ariois were originally required to remain unmarried. But in this hot climate, where the urge toward procreation was particularly strong, the rule had gradually been relaxed, and marriage had been permitted. In order to maintain the intention of a childless state, however, they eventually began to kill the newborn children of members immediately after birth. The Ariois enjoyed numerous privileges and were held in high regard throughout the Society Islands. Most remarkable was that they themselves considered their greatest honor to be childlessness. When Tupaia heard that the King of England had a large family, he thought himself far nobler, simply because he, as an Arioi, had no children. In most other countries, being called a father was a mark of honor. On Tahiti, however, the word was used by an Arioi as an insult and a term of contempt. The Ariois held large gatherings at specific times, traveling from island to island and living there in lavish abundance. They enjoyed the finest fruits and consumed large quantities of pigs, dogs, fish, and chickens, which had to be provided by the tautos, the lowest class of society. Soothing drinks made from pepper root were never absent from these events, as the Ariois took great pleasure in drinking. Music and dance were their constant entertainment, with the nightly dances often described as excessively indulgent. Entry, however, was strictly limited to members of the community. In a land like Tahiti, which had long since moved far from barbarism, a society so seemingly harmful to the people would surely have been abolished if it had not also brought significant advantages. One of the main reasons for its continued existence seemed to be that a sufficient number of warriors was always ready to defend the land, since all Ariois were warriors. To ensure that love and family ties would not weaken them, they were required to remain unmarried. Another possible reason for the founding of this society may have been to limit the rapid reproduction of chiefs and nobles. Perhaps a far-sighted lawgiver of Tahiti had foreseen that an overabundance of petty tyrants would soon oppress the common people. To prevent this, a celibate lifestyle was prescribed, in exchange for which they were granted dazzling privileges. These included the high esteem of the people and the resources to live a life of pleasure, feasting, and celebration. The traditional privilege of warriors before they became starving mercenaries. It was likely that the Ariois, in earlier times, had deserved the respect they received through impeccable conduct more than they did now. But once they broke the rules of their order in regard to marriage, the original spirit of the community began to fade in other areas as well, and indulgence and excess replaced chastity and moderation. At present, the Ariois are without doubt the greatest lovers of pleasure among their countrymen. Nevertheless, Georg could find no evidence that they had resorted to new or unusual inventions to satisfy their sensual desires. Although they had been accused of the most abhorrent kind of licentious excess, in particular, the claim that their women were common property shared by all members of the order. Such a practice would be entirely contrary to the character of this nation. And upon closer inquiry, the European visitors were expressly assured of the opposite. This tale, therefore, must be regarded as pure fiction, the invention of certain frivolous and superficial travelers or travel writers who perhaps aimed to entertain their audience with other such adventurous fables.
That brings us to the end of episode 45 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. Having left Tahiti behind, the crew sailed first to Huaheine and then reached Raiatea, where encounters with both friends and new social orders offered a deeper glimpse into the complexity of life in the Society Islands. If you don't want to miss what comes next, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. In the show notes, you'll find a link to the episode map and a PayPal link if you'd like to support the project. Our journey with Georg Forster, Captain Cook, and the Resolution continues next week. Because life is a journey, and being part of it is everything.